Good evening once again. Thank you for joining us for the Refresher Resume webinar presented specifically for students within the Health Information Management and Health Services Administration programs here at CUNY School of Professional Studies. My name is Shannon Gallo. I am the Manager of Career Services here at CUNY SPS, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with all of you this evening. So we'll start off with this quick introduction, just a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleague, Nikita Cassidy, for joining us this evening as well. She's going to be providing support technically for us in our webinar. As I mentioned on the screen, thank you, Nikita. As I mentioned on the screen, we would like for you to please include your full name as your screen name so that we can make sure we are confirming your attendance at this webinar. We also request that you remain on mute throughout the webinar. And as I had said before, I will be happy to answer questions once I've covered the content this evening, and you're welcome to send those to us via chat. We are making the captions available through Zoom. If you would like to take advantage of the captions, please feel free to do so. Lastly, we will be sending the recording slides as well as the handouts that we use in tonight's webinar to all of our participants, along with an evaluation that you'll hopefully take a minute or two to fill out for us. So thank you all. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to us in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them at the end. Tonight's topic is refresher resumes, so certainly we'll go over resumes for the bulk of the time. I'll also talk very briefly about references, cover letters, and follow-up thank you letters. I'll go over a little bit about employment applications and filling out online job applicant profiles. And as I said, we'll cover some questions at the end. So jumping right into it. The primary formats that are used on resumes, you may have heard of these. The most popular resume format and probably most widely used is what we call reverse chronological. And this is your typical resume that involves listing your experience in order from most recent or current to least recent. This type of resume format focuses primarily on job titles and organizations in which you've worked. And finally, it highlights career progress, the growth that you've made in your career over years, employer loyalty, and certainly recent accomplishments. The second common type of resume format is a functional resume, sometimes called competency-based resume. These types of resumes are focused instead on qualifications, competencies, and achievements. This type of resume highlights your fine-tuned professional skills as well as intangible or transferable skills that you possess. This type of resume can be very useful for career changers, people who are very entry-level with very little professional experience, or even those who are re-entering the workforce after a lengthy absence. It's important to keep in mind that both of these types of resume formats are very common. There also is a type of resume format that's somewhat of a combination of reverse chronological and functional. So my advice to you as a job seeker is to consider any of these types of resumes and talk with a career advisor to figure out which type of format might work best for you. Now I'll talk a little bit about making changes or updates to a resume. And these pointers and tips that are covered this evening for resumes are useful whether you're creating a document from scratch or you are retooling or reworking or updating a resume. The first thing to keep in mind when you're getting started is highly recommend that you basically start from scratch. Even if you have a resume from the past, but you're making large scale changes and it is in a template, I suggest that you open it up in Microsoft Word, copy all of the content, and then paste it into a new Microsoft Word document and remove all the formatting. The reason for this is that what happens in templates is that it can be very difficult to make changes or move things around to suit the type of resume you'd like to build. Now I'll talk a little bit about the recommended fonts for resumes. Typically, it's suggested to use a size between 10 point and 12 point. It's not too small and not too large. We recommend that you use the same font throughout the document. And that being said, a simpler, less flashy font typically works better for a resume. Generally, the rule of thumb is less is more, and I think that simpler is definitely better. A couple of examples of different types of fonts might be Times New Roman, Arial font, Verdana, Trahoma. Those are just a couple of examples of the fonts that are really good to use on a resume. It's also suggested that you use black only on resumes. And also, as I've already suggested, taking the resume out of a template, that you can use bold, italic, or underlining for emphasis. Occasionally, templates will use these same kinds of things for emphasizing different parts of a resume, but again, it's difficult to make changes to the document if it's already in a template. A couple of other important things to keep in mind for your document is the importance of making a document that is consistent and clean. And by consistent and clean, I mean making sure that your margins are aligned throughout the document. Make sure that each subheading, job title and location, date, all of those things are done in the same way, lined up, and have the same type of emphasis. So if you talk about one job and you bold the name of the employer and italicize the job title and italicize the dates and locations, you want to make sure that you bold the employer and italicize everything else for all of your other jobs. Typically, no graphics should be used on a resume and no photos should be used on a resume. Lastly, using a bulleted format can keep the resume very neat and clean and make it very easy for someone to read quickly. Okay, before I move on to this section, I just want to take a moment and show a sample resume document that just kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that I've just spoken about. So everyone should be able to see a reverse chronological format resume sample on your screen. Okay. As we said earlier, feel free to send questions in the chat and we'll go ahead and address those later on. So as you can see, this type of resume is a very traditional type of format. Notice how the experience, all of the subheadings are done the same way. Dates are all bolded, as well as job title, employer, and location. The bulleted format makes this document very easy to read quickly. It also explains the different sections of the resume, make it very clear in explaining different things. The second type is an example of a functional resume. As I had shared before, this one is more based on competencies, and this one is more based on competencies and skills, but it also lists the employment history just so that the employer has an idea that there is work experience. Next, this particular resume is done still in reverse chronological format, but it's just slightly different than the other one and still using some different types of emphasis, italicized, bolding, those kinds of things. Okay. As I said before, we will share the slides, the handouts, and a recording after the webinar. So don't worry if you didn't get to see too much of that particular part. Now I'm moving into content for resumes. This is where verb tenses and variety are very important. When you're describing a current job, you want to make sure that you use the present tense. And when you're describing a prior job, make sure that you use the past tense. This is so that when an employer is reading the resume, they're able to use the correct voice in their head. Make sure that each bullet begins with the very strongest action verb. Avoid repeating words or phrases or sentences in the document, especially right after one another. So you don't want to continue to say, assist with this, assist with that, assist with those things. You want to make sure that you provide a little bit of variety so that the reader doesn't lose interest. Finally, use descriptive words, but don't overdo it and still be honest. Connotation and quantity. And by connotation and quantity, I'm talking about choosing phrases that evoke a positive thought rather than negative. These make a person think favorably of the resume rather than negative. Quantity is very, very important for the resume. This is where you want to make sure that in any way possible, you're able to add accurate and honest numbers, percentages, dollar amounts, statistics, things like that. Those can go a long way to show the true impact that you make in your work and also add credibility to what you're describing on the document. So I'll take a moment and show a couple of these things on these resume examples again. Okay. Okay, so on this particular reverse chronological resume, notice how each bullet starts with the strong action verb, provide, monitor and manage, assist, implement. And these positions, because they are a part of the current job, are listed in present tense. As you go down the resume and see previous jobs, these verbs are past tense. And notice how this particular resume, even though the word assisted is used multiple times, it's used one time to describe something in the current position, and it's used another time to describe something in a prior position. And note that these particular responsibilities or achievements are completely different, even though the same verb is used. Okay. Now I'll talk a little bit about making sure that your resume document is achievement and results oriented. And this is very, very important, once again, to show your impact and really help the prospective employer understand the difference that you could make if they hire you. You always want to make sure that you indicate promotions or expanded responsibilities. So if you've been working in the same organization for many years, but your job has changed and expanded, even if you haven't necessarily gotten a new job title, it's important to indicate that specifically on the resume. Make sure that you're adding those little things that you do in your job that are outside of your quote unquote job description. Many times we do lots of things as part of our work that are not necessarily part of our job description, but we do them anyway. And that's really, really important for employers to understand when they're reading your resume. Make sure that you describe special projects that you've managed, or if you have made suggestions to make a difference in the organization, if you've generated ideas and some of those ideas have become implemented in the organization. Maybe you figured out a way to save money. Maybe you figured out a way to re-engineer processes to make them more efficient. Or maybe you figured out a way to provide a better, more courteous service to patients or customers. Make sure that you include any supervisory responsibilities that you have, even if your job title doesn't indicate that you're a supervisor. These can be things like hiring and training, performance management, budget control, scheduling, inventory, those kinds of things that you might not think are that crucial to include, but they can really go a long way to show, again, the achievements that you've made and the results that you've achieved and the impact that you've made. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about a summary. And this is something on a resume that can be very useful for experienced professionals and career changers. It also might double as your personal pitch. If you've attended a webinar that we typically offer once a year that is on the personal pitch, the summary from your resume can be very similar. The summary on your LinkedIn profile might also be very similar to that summary that you use on your resume. And this is a way to provide sort of an overview of your qualifications and also your career goal and your career objectives. And the summary can be, as I say before, very useful for career changers. It's also a nice way to really set the tone for what you want the employer to gather when they're reading the resume. Buzzwords, also an important thing to keep in mind on your resume, also known as keywords. This is where you want to make sure that you are being industry specific. Be very careful with acronyms. This is something that I see quite frequently when I'm talking with students in the healthcare field. I'll mention one of these things in particular, the HIPAA, which is HIPAA. Many, many times I have noticed on resumes that people indicate this as HIPPA, which is incorrect. And that is certainly a red flag for an employer if you have something on your resume that's not listed correctly. Also keep in mind that if there are proprietary systems you're using in your position or acronyms that might be unfamiliar to an employer in a different organization, make sure that you either write out what the acronym means or describe what the acronym means. Take your cues from job postings in the field that you're interested in. So if you're looking to make a career change, this is where you might want to use the word patient rather than constituent or client. Lastly, make sure that the skills and keywords that you're using on your resume are relevant and current. Typically, I do not suggest that you list the specific version of Microsoft Word, for example, or the Mac operating system that you're familiar with. However, I do suggest if you're listing your coding skills and things like that, that you list the most recent updates and the most relevant skill sets that you possess. Those things are very, very important in the health information and health services field. Let me bring this document back over. Make sure that I'm mentioning what I need to. Okay, so this is a great example when I was talking about acronyms. Medical assistant, MA. There are other acronyms in here that may not necessarily be familiar to everyone, but since this is a particular healthcare resume, that makes sense. Department of Health can be abbreviated using the acronym DOH. Also note that this particular person accurately included these acronyms. They listed proficiency with certain programs. They also have listed the names of medical record types of software that would be familiar to someone. And they also have paid close attention and listed their certifications, which is also very useful. You've worked very, very hard to earn your degree and earn any certifications. You want to make sure that you list those on your resume. Lastly, I'll give a couple final pointers on resumes before I move on to the other section. And this is really based on the overall impression that you make with the document. These are just some pointers that I picked up from my days working in staffing. The first of those is print the document out for a final review. There's something about having a hard copy paper in your hand to look over that can help you pick out little small details that might need to be fixed. I also suggest going over the document out loud. And that was something I picked up when I was an undergraduate studying journalism. Anytime we wrote an article, we would read it out loud to see how it sounded to the reader. That's a good way to get an idea of how the document flows and how the language flows to the reader. I also suggest, especially if you're using reverse chronological format, that you read the document from bottom to top. This is how you can easily tell if you've done a good job to show career progression from least recent to most recent. I also suggest that when you are creating your resume document, that you do the work on it in Microsoft Word and then have that version available and saved, as well as saving it as a PDF, so that if you're submitting it for online applications or into different portals, or you're emailing it to someone, typically, unless specified, you could send the document as a PDF and feel pretty confident that whatever device that particular person is using to read the document will not impact the formatting of it. So if they're looking at it on a smartphone or a tablet or iPad, or maybe they're using a laptop or a Surface or a PC, any of those things, a PDF typically will not lose format. Lastly, I suggest that if you want to include hyperlinks on your resume, make sure that they're working properly. Certainly over the years, websites can change, organizations can go extinct. Just make sure that hyperlinks are valid anytime you have them on your resume. And lastly, I mentioned LinkedIn, and that it's a good idea to, there is a way to attach your resume to LinkedIn, and it's also a good idea to add your link to your profile to your resume. So those are kind of the final pointers that I have about resumes thus far. I did want to remind everyone that you are welcome to send questions in, and we'll do our best to answer those toward the end of the program. And I hope that everything you're learning is either familiar to you, or if it's new to you, that it seems to be worthwhile so far. Okay, so moving into the references sheet, and this is something that I think can go a long way for job seekers. It's a document that should be separate from your resume. Certainly to keep in mind, typically it's suggested that you have at least 3 references. And the idea with keeping this separate from your resume is that typically when you're applying for jobs, you would not send the references. And you also don't need to include that little line on the end of the resume that says references available upon request. If an employer is interested in getting your references, they will ask. So as I was saying, making the separate sheet with 3 professional references, I would say, if possible, having a former supervisor is very, very useful on a resume. Colleagues who you've worked with previously, vendors, clients, those are all useful to use. Another type of person that can be useful to include as a reference is an instructor, particularly if you did very, very well in a course and your professor got to know you rather well. They may be able to provide a professional reference for you. Especially if you're making a career change, it might be a nice idea to find an instructor who could be a reference for you, because they could talk about your interests and how well you were able to pick up on materials in your chosen field, even though you didn't have experience in that field previously. Another thing that can be helpful with making a references sheet is that, and I'll talk about this later, when you're filling out an online application or an online profile, it can be really helpful to have that references sheet handy to make sure you're including the correct information on those applications and forms. The other thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that anyone who's being included on your references sheet is aware and is open and available to provide a reference if requested. And if any of that information changes, make sure that you're regularly checking with those individuals to make sure you're updating the references sheet. It's definitely something that takes a little bit of time to prepare and really think about, but I think it can go a long way to have it ready to go anytime you're starting a job search. So now I'll talk a little bit about cover letters. And cover letters can be a very important piece of your job search toolkit. But the best way to do them is to really take the time to make them targeted and make them specific. It seems like it takes a long time, and it really can at the beginning, but it's typically most effective if you can make them specific and not use a form template. So a couple of important things to keep in mind: cite the job requirements, and how you meet those requirements, how you're qualified for the position in the cover letter, show some enthusiasm for the job, and articulate to that employer how you understand what the organization is. Maybe take a quick look at their website and get an idea of what their vision and their mission are and how you identify with those. It also is a nice way to explain what you're passionate about and what your work personality would be. The other part of cover letters, as I mentioned, if they're targeted and specific, they can really go a long way to prove that you are a serious candidate, and they can really help you to be prepared for a future interview. Because the idea is if you take the time to really look closely and analyze what they're looking for in the position and how you meet what they're looking for in the position, that really can go a long way for your interview and allow you to sort of have a starting point when you're preparing for your interview to know the kinds of things that you cited in your cover letter must be the kinds of things that you want to focus on in your interview. I'll take a minute and show you a sample. Again, we'll send you all of these documents to use as guides for constructing your own documents. As I mentioned before, this particular cover letter, it goes so far as to use a bulleted format where you would just pick a couple of what you see as the most important qualifications that they're looking for, and indicate in those bullets how you meet those qualifications. Take a little bit of time to talk about what you know about the organization and why you want to work there. And finally, at the end, this is where you can include other details. As I had mentioned before, maybe indicate something, to the effect of your interest in making a career change and how you've, pursued your degree in the field and how you transfer your previous knowledge and experiences for the position. All of those kinds of things. I will add one other, actually, I'll go ahead and move into thank you letters first. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the follow-up thank you letter. And this is really what you would do following an interview. And the first bullet says, are they necessary? And the answer is yes. Anytime you do an interview, even if it's a quick phone screen, it makes sense to send some sort of follow-up letter to the person you spoke with. Typically, email works best. Of course, certainly with the number of organizations and people who are working hybrid or completely remote, at many times there may not even be an address to send snail mail. So it's most important to do email. And typically I suggest sending that thank you within 24 hours or 48 hours at most. When you're deciding on the length and content of your follow-up thank you letter, I think a good rule of thumb is that the longer, more detailed, and farther in the process you are for the interview, the longer, more detailed the thank you letter should be. So if it's a quick phone screen, as I mentioned, maybe it's just a 2-sentence email thanking them for their time and reiterating your interest in the position. If it's a third round interview with 3 or 4 individuals from the company, then you're probably going to want to take some time to really, be more strategic, really address a lot of the things that were spoken about in the conversation, refer back to some of those things, and again, reiterate your interest and mention next steps that they may have told you about in the interviewer. Typically, if you're following up after interviewing with multiple interviewers, If you're able to address each of those individuals, great. If not, typically send that thank you letter to the person who was the lead of the search committee or the person who you were communicating with most regularly, and mention how nice it was to also talk with the other interviewers and ask them to pass along your appreciation. Finally, if you're not interested in the position, I suggest still sending a thank you note. This is because you never know what the future holds. It's possible that whatever it was about that position that has turned you off could change in the future. It's possible that that particular individual may find out about a different position in the future, and you want to make sure that you really build those bridges rather than burn the bridges. So I think it's always a good idea to follow up, even if you don't think you're interested in that position, just to make sure that you're covering all the bases and setting yourself up to maintain a relationship with that individual, if possible, in the future. Okay, now before we move into questions, I'll talk a little bit about filling out online applications. And this is something that I always like to cover when we're talking with our healthcare related job seekers, because many times if you are looking at larger hospital facilities or even smaller facilities, they typically have some sort of online applicant tracking system, whether you're setting up an online profile and then submitting your resume to open positions that come, or you're submitting an online application for individual positions. It's important to make sure that you're doing those things well. So anytime you're filling out applications, make sure that you fill them out completely. If they ask you to copy and paste a resume into the system or upload a resume into the system, I suggest, as I mentioned before, if possible to upload a PDF, great, do it. That's the best way to make sure that your resume does not get thrown off with format. If instead it asks you to copy and paste the document, I would suggest that you put it go into your Microsoft Word resume, put it into what's called rich text format, copy it from there and paste it into the applicant tracking system. From there, it makes it just a little bit easier to make any changes to the format that may have gotten thrown off when you pasted the document. Make sure that even on applications and online profiles that you're honest and you're forthcoming. Answer all the questions, even if they are asking for your resume and that information is provided on the resume. Make sure that you answer all the questions. Use your resume and your references sheet to make sure that you're answering all the questions and you're doing so accurately. One of the things that I will share, I've been at CUNY for many years, and one of the most important things for even when we are looking for employees within CUNY is that applicants take the time to answer all the questions and provide all the information that we're asking in the application. It is incredibly important, especially in other organizations that also are highly regulated, like healthcare at times. Sometimes an employer is not even able to consider a candidate for a position if they have not answered all the questions. So make sure that you keep that in mind. I also suggest that if it makes a cover letter optional, that you take a couple of minutes to include that as well. And finally, when you are submitting your information, whether it's an applicant tracking system for a specific job or you're filling out a candidate profile, go into those profiles and make updates regularly, even if it's switching around a couple of words here and there or changing up just a couple of things in the resume. This is also true for LinkedIn. What happens in many of those systems is when a job becomes available and the recruiters and hiring managers are logging on to those candidate profiles, their search results will show up with the ones that have been recently updated first. So if you take a little bit of time to make sure that your information is not stale in those systems, you may be more likely to show up on the top of the list. Just a little pointer of something that I used to experience when I was working in staffing. The other thing to keep in mind is that make sure that you follow all of the instructions completely on these applications, because many times that is the first level of screening that an organization will do. The other thing is that many times, if these applicant tracking systems are using more and more of the AI technologies, those types of things will also be unable to accurately grasp the information in your profile if you haven't answered all the questions. So just keep that in mind when you're going online and doing those things for your job search. Okay, so I've been able to cover all of the material thus far, and we have a little bit more time. I will take a quick minute, and there is an example of a professional references page here that all of you can see. There's an example of some of those summaries and objective statements that are useful. And there's also the cover letter and follow-up thank you letters. Okay, so I will take a couple of minutes and